Hi everybody, I'm Scott, and welcome to my channel, Shelfware. Today I'm going to talk about podcasting. I've realized that I'm relatively new in BookTube, and I realize that when I talk about a book, I often want to refer to a podcast, and that's because I come from the podcasting world, and I thought I would share this context. So I think the best way, I would like to talk about my history in podcasting, but that may not interest everybody. So here at the beginning, I think I'm just going to tell what I'm into right now. And then I'm going to go back up and talk about my history in podcasting for anybody who's interested in that. So what I have going right now. So I'm a co-host of A Good Story is Hard to Find podcast, which is with my friend Julie in Dallas. And I am, Julie Davis is her name. And I am in northern Utah. So we get together online every other Thursday morning and we record a podcast on either a book or a movie. We're both Catholics, so what the idea of the podcast is that we're talking about these books and movies as Catholics. In other words, we're just allowing that to enter the conversation. It's not, as you would say, a Catholic podcast where we're preaching or anything like that. It's just the idea that we don't leave that at the door when we come in. It's like bringing that with us. And we're selecting books and movies that hit us in ways that that kind of discussion is fruitful. So I was, that maybe midrash stuff that was going around. It's similar to that. Well, it's basically we're bringing that to the table as we talk about these books, and it's been very rewarding to me anyway, personally. And we've been doing that. We're in our 10th year of doing that podcast. So A Good Story is Hard to Find is a riff on Flannery O'Connor. And we've done three Flannery O'Connor episodes, I believe. And so she's one of our favorites. So that's one thing that I've got going on. And then as far as regular involvement, I am the editor for the Reading Short and Deep podcast, which has my friend Jesse Willis, good friend Jesse Willis, and my other friend Dr. Eric Rabkin. They're talking about short stories that are all in the public domain, and they talk about it in about a half an hour. In fact, almost all of them are rated a half an hour. And really nice discussions. I really enjoy them, which is a good thing because I just looked it up. I've done 227 episodes I've edited for them. I say for them, but for me as well. I'm part of the team there, and I really enjoy that a lot because their discussions are always fun. So I do that, and that continues. And then I'm an occasional guest on the SFFaudio Podcast, SFFaudio.com. SFF stands for Science Fiction Fantasy Audio. And I'll get into the history of that site in a minute for those that are interested. But that is the podcast as it stands today. The SFFaudio Podcast is hosted by my great friend Jesse Willis again. And he does a read-along every week. And a read-along is a discussion of a book with other people who have read it. And which is my favorite thing. I'll get into that too. So I'm occasionally on that podcast, probably not quite once a month, but we often set up times and books, as things occur to us. But he's got a whole bunch of people that are part of that podcast with him, and it's great fun to listen to. And then I'm also probably an annual guest on the Reading Envy podcast, hosted by Jenny Colvin. And I'll talk about the history of that as well. But what Jenny does is she brings a guest on and she talks about basically, what are you reading? What are you reading that's interesting? I think the way she's doing it right now is she'll bring 2 books and the guest will bring 3. So whether they talk about 5 or 6 books during about an hour is how the podcast goes. And it's what you've recently read that has really interested you. And it's a great podcast that will feed your TBR quite a bit. So those are the things that I'm doing right now actively in the podcasting world. So now I want to talk about my history with audio and podcasting, which may not interest everybody. I don't know why I feel like I'm apologizing, but I'm like, this is super interesting to me, and I don't know how many other people it interests. But obviously I love it because I just keep doing it. I've always enjoyed audiobooks since I was tiny. In the 80s, I remember going to the local library, and they had a cassette section. Back then in the 80s, having an unabridged audiobook was rare. I don't know how many of you know this, but if a novel were to come out on audiobook back then, it was most likely abridged, because they would think, well, my goodness, how many cassettes would it take to read Dune? I don't know. They were still doing cassettes when A Game of Thrones came out, and I think A Game of Thrones was 17 cassettes long. I used to have that copy of it. I'll explain why in a minute. But back in the 80s, which is well before Game of Thrones times, I recall Walden tapes, for example. The one that leaps to mind is Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. They put that on 2 cassettes. So someone would write an abridgment, and then they would read it over 2 cassettes, and that was an audiobook. And super common. Star Trek was common. Star Trek novels started coming out, and right after 1979 is when Star Trek the Motion Picture came out. Well, that renewed interest in Star Trek, so novels started to be published. The Entropy Effect by Vonda McIntyre, for example, was abridged to a single cassette, read by George Takei. And then later on, as time moved on, that became 2 cassettes. You would have Star Trek abridgments that were 2 cassettes long. And now the Star Trek audiobooks are now unabridged. And they're all like 300 pages long now. So every audiobook is like 9 or 10 hours long. You'd spend your rest of your life listening to Star Trek audiobooks. So, but I digress. The reason that I'm bringing up audiobooks, because that's related to podcasting in my head, because with Jesse Willis, we started SFFaudio.com in March of 2003. And the purpose of SFFaudio.com at the time, podcasting wasn't a thing at that time, was to review audiobooks. And part of that reason was, hey, if we're reviewing audiobooks, maybe they'll send us audiobooks to review. And boy, did they. I mean, it was super successful. Audiobooks were so expensive. $30 for one. And, they're about like that right now if you were getting a hard copy. But back then, that was a heck of a lot of money, especially for me. And what ended up happening with SFF Audio, we would write publicists and say, hey, we've got this audiobook review site. We're like science fiction. What science fiction titles do you have? And send them to us. And they would. And we would get boxes in the mail all the time. I would. Man, it was fun. Super enjoyable. So we wrote a ton of audiobook reviews on sffaudio.com, and they're all there. Well, then the Kick-Ass Mystic Ninjas, okay, podcasting started to be a thing. We started the site in 2003. I have some things written over here, which is why I keep looking over there. But the Kick-Ass Mystic Ninjas started in probably late 2005 to 2006. And what they would do is they would talk about a book or a movie. And I don't know if they ever called it a read-along, but they got 2 or 3 people together and they would talk about a book or a movie in depth with other people who have read it. And that was super interesting to me. It was more interesting than trying to talk about a book on a podcast without spoiling it. Because the spoilers, to talk about it in depth, is where the interesting conversation is. And I still believe that. So Jesse and I started the SFFaudio podcast a couple of years after that. I'm showing September 1, 2008 as the first SFFaudio podcast. But we weren't doing read-alongs at the beginning. What we were doing is what was going on in the audiobook world. We would talk about audiobooks. What was new? What was a new release? Didn't we like this? Didn't we like that? Hey, they're going to do this. What's coming? What has arrived? Anything that was sent to us, we talk about. And we did that. And then in 2010, on March 15th, I looked this up because this was kind of a watershed moment, episode number 50. For me, it was anyway. Jesse and I sat down and recorded a conversation that we had about The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. And that was the first read-along that I had participated in, and I think it's the first one Jesse participated in. And it was revelatory. I mean, it was like, oh my gosh, this is where it's very interesting. To sit down and talk about a book with someone else who has read it is really where it's at. And that became the read-along. SFFaudio from that point forward became more and more about the read-along until today. Now that's 100% what it is. We became less and less about trying to talk about what arrivals were and all that, and more about the read-along. So, and SFFaudio right now is pretty much, it's a site, so I had to back away from that due to work obligations. I just couldn't keep up with it. And Jesse has continued it on. And what SFFaudio is now is a tremendous resource for public domain PDF pages. Jesse is constantly on the lookout for what is public domain, and he'll scan that stuff in and post it as PDFs. So there is a vast library of public domain PDFs on sffaudio.com. And then this podcast. So it's a home for this podcast. And the Reading Short and Deep podcast, which I mentioned earlier, is also hosted on the same site. So the SFFaudio podcast, the PDF page, and the Reading Short and Deep podcast are what SFFaudio is all about at the moment. And it's awesome. So, okay, so we started to do more and more read-alongs, and then I was on a read-along with Jesse and a friend named Julie Davis that I mentioned before. We were on SFFaudio, and we talked about The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester. After that podcast, something occurred to me, and I wrote a note to Julie, who is a fellow Catholic, and I said, hey, isn't this interesting? This struck me this way as a religious person. And she said, what about this and that? And the next thing you know, we're talking about our own podcast, and we started one called A Good Story is Hard to Find. And the first episode of that went up in January of 2011. And we're still going at it today. So we're in our 10th year. And again, I described what that podcast is already, but that was the genesis of it, is that we were both on SFFaudio, and we both thought of things after that occurred to us as Catholics. And, hey, if I was talking about this book as a Catholic, these points are very, very interesting. And that became the genesis of what we do on Good Story. And here we are 10 years later, still doing it. So during that time, I, again, stopped writing reviews and things for SFFaudio. I can't remember what date that was that I kind of officially stepped back. But that was sometime after 2011, I think. Then in 2014, with another person that was part of the SFFaudio crowd, I started doing a podcast with Jenny Colvin called Reading Envy. And I described what that podcast is. It was the same as it was when we started. The idea there was, let's just talk about whatever it is we're reading. No genre limitations, no limitations whatsoever. What is it that you're reading? And let's talk about those things. And so I was the co-host on that podcast for a few episodes. And on that one, I look back on that and it saddens me that I wasn't able to keep going on that one, but that was reality. I just couldn't keep up. I just absolutely couldn't keep up. I had a job that was taking a lot out of me, and a place that I was having a lot of difficulty, had to travel a lot. It just wasn't a good situation for me personally when I look back on that. But anyway, I had to back away from that, and Jenny Colvin has taken that and run with it, and it's always been her podcast, but she has just done a terrific job with it. It's very popular. I urge you to check it out if you haven't. So they're still going today. They're 200 something episodes in, I believe. In fact, her latest episode, the guest was Gail Carriger, who some of you may recognize, the author Gail Carriger. And just had her on talking about what she's reading, and fascinating stuff. But yeah, please check that out. That's Reading Envy. And then Jesse started his second podcast called Reading Short and Deep. That was on February 10th of 2016, and I started editing that one for those two, and enjoying them still quite a bit now. And they're on episode 227, like I said. So the latest SFFaudio is The Silver Key by H.P. Lovecraft, and that's episode 581 and counting. So Jesse's been on every one of those episodes, 581, and his episodes sometimes go over an hour. So, but a lot of them have a audiobook component where he'll include the audiobooks. So this one actually is an audiobook and a read-along. So it's the audiobook followed by the discussion of The Silver Key by H.P. Lovecraft. And absolutely terrific. So again, I guess just to wrap this up, so that's my history in the podcasting world, and it is what I love. Again, that discussion about a book with people who have read the book, without regarding spoilers, is the most interesting book discussions that I've been involved with. And I hope to continue doing that. So there we go. So if anybody has any questions about podcasting, you're welcome to contact me. I'm putting my contact info there. But if you want to know how it's done, or anything about it that you'd like, any questions you might have, leave it in the comments or write me an email. So, all right. Thanks, everyone. I hope you stay well. I hope you are well. I hope you stay well, and all the very best. Take care. See you soon.